Early agreement ahead of this week's Jobs Summit to welcome more permanent migrants to help solve the skills shortage.
We are, with the exception of First Nations people or migrants or descendants of migrants, we're a migration country.
No signs of survivors after a light plane crashes in dense bushland west of Brisbane. A teenage girl arrested over stabbing a fellow student in central west New South Wales.
And coming up on The Business, looking for a new accord. Can a deal between unions and small business survive this week's Jobs Summit?
Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. Anthony Albanese's Jobs and Skills Summit doesn't begin until later this week, but already there is some agreement increasing the number of permanent skilled migrants. Business and unions say less reliance on temporary migration to fill skills shortages will have spin-offs beyond the workforce. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Marking a milestone in his time as Prime Minister.
We've been in government now for just 100 days, but my colleagues and I are not there just to mark time.
Anthony Albanese promising to bring reformist zeal to the post-pandemic period.
From response and recovery to reform and renewal.
Framing this week's Jobs and Skills Summit as a search for consensus on changes to industrial settings that'll spur wage growth.
The biggest single outcome I'm hoping for is the beginning of a new culture of cooperation.
And for now, at least, there's goodwill to be had.
We are totally agreed on this, that we shift to more permanent migration, more permanent pathways.
Potential agreement on how best to plug chronic worker shortages being experienced in multiple sectors.
A shift back to permanent migration being at the core of our migration program.
And the Prime Minister's clearly listening.
Far better to give someone a sense of ownership and a stake in this country.
While we can just about lock in higher permanent skilled migration, the Jobs and Skills Summit will also generate greater demand for government services, training and apprentice support, all of which will be expensive. How the Albanese government would pay for that, especially with $240 billion in legislated tax cuts around the corner, remains the big budget question.
I said at the time that it wasn't wise.
Can you guarantee here and now that those tax cuts will remain as they are?
We made a decision that we would stand by that legislation rather than relitigate it, and we haven't changed our opinion.
Perhaps watch this space. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
A high-ranking Sydney bikie who survived being shot earlier this year has been charged with an underworld murder. Tarek Zahed was arrested by heavily armed police in what authorities hope could be a turning point in the city's gangland wars.
It was an arrest fit for a kingpin. Bikie boss Tarek Zahed is frog-marched into custody beside a busy eastern suburbs thoroughfare.
He was given a reception in Sydney that was deserved, and he was OK. He was battered and bruised and put on the footpath.
Fearing he was armed, tactical officers left nothing to chance.
The beanbag rounds were, they deploy those tactics because he was being non-compliant.
Tarek Zahed is no stranger to Sydney's violent underworld. Back in May, he was shot 10 times during an ambush at an Auburn gym, which killed his younger brother Omar. After spending months in hospital, he was back on the streets. Appearing earlier this month with Comanchero National President Alan Meehan and a caption of defiance. Hard to kill, maybe, but not hard for police to find. Zahed had been living in Melbourne, but to comply with a court order, notified officers he'd be returning to Sydney for a function. That's when police pounced.
The risk assessment was that it was high risk. The person involved, has allegedly committed a murder, has previously had very serious and violent crimes that he's committed.
He's been charged with murder and kidnapping over the 2014 death of Yusuf Assoum.
Ms. Joma, how's your client doing?
Have you spoken with him?
There have been at least 15 unsolved gangland murders over the past 2 years, with each seemingly more brazen than the last. Pressure has been intensifying on police to make meaningful arrests. With Tariq Zahed now in custody, investigators are eyeing further underworld figures.
This is a first arrest of many, I'm hoping.
Tariq Zahed will apply for bail next week. Jake Lapham, ABC News, Sydney.
Emergency crews are at the site of a light plane crash at Lowood, west of Brisbane, in which 3 people are feared to have died. Kira Jones reports.
The light plane came down in thick bushland near Lake Wivenhoe this afternoon. The alarm was raised about 2:30 when the Cessna failed to arrive at Brisbane's Archerfield Airport. Emergency services rushed to the scene. It was initially quite difficult to get to because of the terrain. Now, we understand the plane left from Roma in Western Queensland this morning and there were 3 people on board. The Australian Transport and Safety Bureau has confirmed it has begun an investigation with officials from Brisbane to head to the site tomorrow.
Kira Jones reporting from Brisbane. An investigation has found the New South Wales Rural Fire Service failed to pass crucial information to the crew of a firefighting plane that crashed in January 2020. 3 people were killed when the air tanker went down near Cooma in the Snowy Mountains during Australia's Black Summer bushfires.
It was the biggest aircraft to crash on Australian soil, but there was little left intact. It claimed the lives of 3 American firefighters.
All 3 were far from home, helping to defend lives and property during the worst fire season in Australia on record.
The C-130 was at Peakview, north of Cooma, dropping retardant on a blaze. It was battling rapid gusts of wind and ran into problems when it started to climb.
The aircraft likely aerodynamically stalled when flying in hazardous conditions.
Earlier that day, a small spotter aircraft rejected a request to assess the conditions in the Snowy Mountains due to safety concerns. A 737 was also sent to nearby Adaminaby, but shortly after advised all aircraft should stop operating in the area. The Transport Safety Bureau criticised the New South Wales Rural Fire Service for not passing on either report to the C-130 pilot.
It was still a situation where they were operating with partial knowledge and not the full picture.
The RFS defended its actions, saying the 737 pilot had made the C-130 crew aware of the conditions.
The pilots are the ones that make the decisions. They look at the fire grounds, they make a decision on whether it's safe to do something or not.
The report recommends that in future the RFS ensures it passes on all safety information and also considers a policy of cancelling flights over an area if many pilots have deemed it unsafe.
We'll be enacting the recommendations from the ATSB.
The report also recommended the plane's operating company Colson Aviation improve its pre-flight risk assessments. Peter Lusted, ABC News, Canberra.
A 15-year-old girl has been arrested after a stabbing at a school in central west New South Wales. Police were called to the Canobolas Rural Technology High in Orange this afternoon. A 16-year-old girl suffered chest and arm wounds. She was taken to the Orange-based hospital with non-life-threatening injuries.
It's very concerning for police, and we encourage people to talk to their children about safety. Knives are lethal. They should not be carrying knives. They shouldn't be using knives in any way, shape or form other than to cut food.
The 15-year-old girl was taken to Orange Police Station for questioning. The Disability Royal Commission has begun hearings focused on homelessness and inappropriate housing. On any night, there's an estimated 116,000 homeless people in Australia, and the majority of them have a disability. Here's Disability Affairs reporter Elizabeth Wright.
A visitor to Sydney's Wayside Chapel for 3 decades, 51-year-old Danielle lives with schizophrenia. In her 20s, she experienced homelessness.
Especially being in a hospital and having nowhere to go after hospitalisation as well, that's the difficulty. Not only are you homeless, you're homeless and mentally ill, which is double the stigma.
The Wayside Chapel estimates more than 80% of its visitors live with mental health issues.
There are no simple solutions in this. The amount of support required to walk with someone with disabilities from homelessness or insecure housing to secure housing is years and years of work.
This hearing of the Disability Royal Commission in Parramatta will examine the strong links between homelessness and disability, with a particular focus on New South Wales and Victoria.
Whether and to what extent people with disability, particularly people with intellectual or psychosocial disability, are at an increased risk of homelessness.
It's already heard confronting testimony.
Where I am at the moment, with no electricity, was rightly described to me the other day as being a squat.
Danielle is now in secure housing, but the trauma of homelessness remains.
You just feel nothing. You've got nowhere to go. You don't really have the ability or the finance to feel anything, so it's nothingness.
The hearing continues till Friday. Elizabeth Wright, ABC News.
If you or someone you know needs help, please contact Beyond Blue or Lifeline. South Australia's COVID isolation period could be slashed before it one day disappears altogether. The state's Premier has foreshadowed a future in which COVID isolation periods wouldn't be needed, much like the flu. For now, a plan to reduce isolation from 7 days to 5 is being considered and likely to be discussed at National Cabinet this week.
Any South Australians over 30 can now get a fourth COVID jab, but a new government survey shows most people don't even know about it.
COVID immunity fades over time, so keeping up with your vaccines is the best way to stay protected.
The state government is rolling out a new vaccination campaign to get those numbers up.
Vaccination still remains the best tool we have at our disposal to keep COVID at bay in a way that is more manageable.
The current wave of COVID is becoming more manageable. Today, 565 cases were recorded. There are 153 people in hospital and another person has died. The Premier says he's open to reducing the length of time people with COVID have to isolate, something that's likely to be on the agenda when National Cabinet meets on Wednesday.
If there is an opportunity to decrease that isolation requirement from 7 days to 5 days, that would be a good thing, provided it's consistent with the health advice and best practice.
Peter Malinauskas says there is still a need for some mandatory isolation, but he suggested that could change in the future.
We may yet get to a time where mandatory isolation is not required, just as it's not required with the flu.
COVID numbers may be down, but the state's hospitals are as busy as ever. The state government is hiring more nurses to cope with it, but the opposition says that recruitment drive might suffer. It says budding nurses could be lured to Victoria, where the state government there is promising free degrees.
You contrast this to what's happening in South Australia, and Peter Malinauskas is slashing even the most basic incentives like free hospital car parking.
The SA government says it's not planning on offering free nursing degrees, but adds there are already scholarships on offer. Leah McLennan, ABC News, Adelaide.
Victoria's plan to make university free for nursing and midwifery students is now being looked at by other states, prompting warnings it could descend into a bidding war between jurisdictions. And industry leaders in other sectors struggling with skills shortages want governments to consider subsidising their degrees too.
Gemma is happy her future nursing colleagues will benefit from free university, but says it won't help staff like her already on the front line.
It's not going to stop people from leaving and being burnt out.
The Victorian government is desperate to fill glaring gaps in the health system and hopes making university practically free for thousands of nursing and midwifery students will help.
There's a concern that this is just going to start a bidding war between states.
We're all competing at this present time for the same people.
Do you think it could be a good idea for Queensland?
I'll have a look at it.
But some universities say the move sets a precedent for other workforces also experiencing shortages, including engineering and IT.
Picking winners is not necessarily the right solution to the broader national problem.
Dylan Simsek is a second-year IT student.
There is a sour taste in terms of we are a bit jealous.
He estimates he'll rack up a $40,000 HECS bill.
If the cost for the IT degree was cut, and it was incentivised a bit better, I think it would bring in more students for sure.
We know that so many of the people that are in the parliament right now got their university degrees for free, and this is a really good way of doing it.
But free can add up to a budget blowout, and any move to wipe more university fees seems to be a political football many are happy to handball.
I think that really should be the role of the Commonwealth.
It's a good initiative that he's undertaking, but we have our own initiatives as well.
Annie Kearney, ABC News.
The Queensland Government is under increasing pressure to widen an inquiry into casino operations. The state's gambling regulator has confirmed it's investigating a high roller junket scandal at Townsville's casino.
The Star Casino inquiry has been told about high rollers banned in other states being